Shalom. This is Rabbi David Golinkin talking to you from my study at the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. And I bring you Shana Tova greetings from the 85,000 people in the Schechter programs, our rabbinical school, our graduate school, the Tawi school system throughout Israel, Neve Schechter in Tel Aviv, and our Midreshet network throughout the Ukraine. As you know, for 36 years, I've been serving as rabbi at the auxiliary service at Beth David. But unfortunately this year, due to the COVID crisis, I cannot come back. And Andy Pasco was nice enough to invite me to give a shiur, to give a lesson in honor of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which we will now share with the entire Beth David community. I was reminded of the beginning of this week's second parsha. There are two parshiot this Shabbat. The beginning of the parsha Vayelech, Devarim 31. Vayelech Moshe vayidaber et hadvarim ha'ele el kol Yisrael, vayomer alehem ben 120 shana anochi hayom lo uchal od latzet velavo. Moses went and spoke these things to all Israel. He said to them, I am now 120 years old. I can no longer come and go. Of course, he was saying that he can no longer come and go because of his age. But for the past many months, since March, none of us can come and go as we would please. And I can no longer come and go to the United States or Canada as I normally do a number of times every year. But video is the next best thing. And before I get to our topic, I wanted to share with you a story I heard from a friend of mine in Jerusalem a few days ago. He says that a husband and wife have been in lockdown for a number of months. And the husband says to his wife, well, dear, I've decided that we don't want any children. And the wife says, okay, I guess we'll have to tell the kids tonight. But of course, that's the situation we've all been in for many months, where we're tearing our hair out. We're at home much more than we're used to. There are many things we used to do that we cannot do. And therefore, my topic today is essential values of Judaism for times of stress and change. And what I would like to do is share with you 5 basic values or sets of values of Judaism, which I believe can help us in the months and perhaps the year to come in this time of stress and change. And many of these values I selected from sermons that I've given at Beth David during the past 36 years. And the first value I would like to discuss is the value of humility. We think that we're in charge. We think that we rule the universe. After all, we landed a man on the moon. After all, we've sent spaceships to Mars. Don't we rule the universe? And of course, in the opinion of Judaism, we don't rule the universe at all. We are very, very tiny in terms of ruling the universe. And this comes through in the High Holiday liturgy, in the prayer of Hineni, which the Chazan recites at the beginning of Musaf. And every year, I'm used to the beautiful rendition by Cantor Altimor, together at Beth David. And it starts out, Hineni ha'ani mima'as nir'ash v'nivchad mipachad yoshev tilot Yisrael. I am very poor in my deeds. I stand in awe and trembling before God, and I'm asking God's permission to represent the Jewish people in prayer. Afal pi she'ini chedai v'agun lachach, even though I am unworthy, and so on and so forth. It's an entire prayer expressing the humility of the Chazan, standing in awe before God and saying, I'm not worthy to be here standing before you. Another classic Jewish text which expresses humility is found in the book of Devarim, chapter 8. And I'm quoting here from the JPS Hebrew-English Tanakh, a famous passage in Devarim, chapter 8, which we read a few weeks ago in the weekly Torah reading. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God and fail to keep his commandments, his rules, and his laws, which I enjoin upon you today, when you have eaten your fill and have built fine houses to live in, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold have increased, and everything you own has prospered. Beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget the Lord your God who freed you from the land of Egypt, and so on and so forth. And the passage ends in verse 19. Ve'amarta bilvavecha Kochi ve'otzem yadi asali et hachayil hazeh. And you say to yourselves, my own power and the might of my own hand have won this wealth for me. Remember that it is the Lord your God who gives you the power to get wealth, in fulfillment of the covenant that he made an oath with your fathers, as is still the case. In other words, after settling the land and everything's successful, the crops are going well, business is going well, you have fine houses, you'll say, Kochi v'otzem yadi asali et hachayil hazeh. All of this power comes from me. And this passage from Dvarim chapter 8 reminds us, no, Hashem noten lecha koach. God is the one who gives you power. All of your success and all of your agricultural prosperity and all of your beautiful houses come from God. And similarly, we have another famous passage, which is found in the Tractate of Gittin, 56b. And this really reminded me of our current situation. It's in a passage which is the stories of the Churban, of the destruction of the temple. It goes on for about 3.5 folios in the Tractate of Gittin. And in folio 56b, you have there a very famous story about Titus, in English Titus, who was the Roman general who destroyed the temple, who burned the temple, who took the temple utensils to Rome, who built the Arch of Titus to celebrate his triumph, and who was then Roman emperor for 2 years, from the years 79 to 81. And the point of this story in the Tractate of Gittin is to tell us that Titus thinks that he's hot stuff, but he's really nothing. He has no power in comparison to God. And the story is quite lengthy. In the Sansino translation, it takes up most of this page. It says that Titus goes into the Holy of Holies, where he commits an act of harlotry. He sleeps with a zonah, with a harlot, and then he takes all of the clay utensils and he wraps them up, and he goes on a ship off to Rome, and God brings a storm upon the ship, and Titus says, you only have power in the sea. That's why you were able to drown the Egyptians. You have no power over me. So God says to him, and Titus says, if he is really mighty, let him come up on the dry land and fight with me. And a voice went forth from heaven saying, sinner, son of a sinner, descendant of Esav the sinner, I have a tiny creature in my world called a gnat. And in Hebrew it says yitush. Go up on dry land and make war with the gnat. When he landed, the gnat came and entered his nose and it knocked against his brain for 7 years. And the story goes on to describe in excruciating detail how the gnat turned into a brain tumor and killed Titus. The point of the story is that God can even send a tiny yitush. In Hebrew, it's called titus, yitush, Titus and the gnat, can even send a yitush, a tiny gnat, into the brain of Titus to destroy this mighty emperor, and God is much more powerful than Titus is. And of course, we know from the history of the world that that's exactly what happened. The Romans ruled the world. The Romans thought that they were hot stuff. The Roman Empire disappeared some 1,500 years ago, and here the Jewish people is still going strong 1,500 years after the Roman Empire ended. Just as that gnat could destroy the Emperor Titus, the most powerful man in the world, this little virus called COVID-19 has the power to bring the whole world to a stop. And almost 1 million people have died, and 27 million people have fallen ill. A tiny little thing has the power to take over the entire world. And I think, therefore, that the first lesson of our current crisis is the lesson of humility, the lesson of Hineni, the lesson of Dvarim chapter 8, the lesson of the story of Titus in Gittin 56b, and finally, the lesson from the second half of the Natane Tokef prayer, where the Chazan, after reciting who will live and who will die, the Chazan sings, Adam yesodo me'afar, v'sofo le'afar, benafsho yavi lachmo. Man's origin is dust, and he returns to dust. He obtains his bread by the peril of his life. He is like a fragile potsherd, as the grass that withers, as the flower that fades, as the fleeting shadow, as a passing cloud, as the wind that blows, as the floating dust. Yea, as a dream that vanishes, but you are our ever-living God and King. So the first lesson of this crisis is that we need to maintain our sense of humility. We are not in charge. God is in charge of the universe, and sometimes things happen that we have no control over. The second lesson of the current crisis is the lesson of gratitude, or as I called it in my sermon, an attitude of gratitude, or in the article I published about this in the Jerusalem Post in April, the art of saying Todah. And I'd first like to explain what Judaism has to say about the attitude of gratitude and how it relates to our current crisis. This year, Rosh Hashanah starts on Friday night. And what do we chant on Friday night in Psalm 92? Tov laodot l'Adonai ulezamer l'shimcha elyon, la'agid baboker chastecha ve'emunatcha baleilot. It is good to give thanks to the Lord and to sing your praise, O exalted God. And in the 19th century, Robert Louis Stevenson said, the man who has forgotten to be thankful has fallen asleep in the midst of life. Unfortunately, by Stevenson's definition, most people are asleep. We do not express our gratitude to God as we should. We do not thank our families as we could. But why is this so? Why do people neglect to thank each other? Why do they forget to praise God for our beautiful universe? I believe that there are three reasons for this human tendency to forget gratitude. The first, which I already mentioned from Deuteronomy chapter 8, is that when something bad happens, we blame others or God. But when something good happens, we congratulate ourselves and say, oh, this came from me, and I'm not going to read the passage again from Deuteronomy. There is a second reason why we frequently lack a sense of gratitude, because we lack a proper sense of perspective. Here's a personal story. I was scheduled to fly to the US on September 13th, 2001, in order to raise money for the Schechter Institute, and of course, to serve as High Holiday Rabbi at Beth David. And as a result of the horrendous attacks on September 11th, my flight was canceled, my meetings were canceled. I didn't know if I could get to North America at all. And one of my friends said to me, why are you so calm? And I replied, it's a matter of perspective. There are 5,000 people missing and presumed dead in New York. The World Trade Center has been destroyed. Tens of thousands are stranded at airports all over the world. So why should I be upset? The third reason for our lack of gratitude is our attitude. People tend to find in life what they expect to find. If they look for positive things, they find positive things. If they look for negative things, they find negative things. As we learn from Ben Zoma in the Tosefta and the Tractate of Brachot, a grateful guest says, bless my host, how many wines he brought for us, how many portions of food he brought for us, how many cakes he brought for us. But an ingrate says, what did I eat? One piece of bread, one cup of wine, everything he made for the sake of his wife and children. The grateful guest and the ingrate ate the exact same food, yet one utters nothing but praise, while the other offers nothing but criticism. It's all a question of attitude. These three tendencies of human beings can be overcome by three techniques that have been used throughout the ages. Through them, we can acquire the ability to say Todah. The first technique was summed up in a beautiful song by the Jewish composer Irving Berlin. If you're worried and cannot sleep, just count your blessings instead of sheep, and you'll fall asleep counting your blessings. If we stop for a moment and actually count our blessings, we will be surprised to find that our blessings far outnumber our misfortunes. The second technique for cultivating an attitude of gratitude can be summed up in one of my favorite expressions. If we all went to the marketplace hoping to exchange our troubles, we'd each come home with our own. And the third and last technique for cultivating an attitude of gratitude is to learn how to verbalize our thanks. It's not enough to think about how thankful we are to God. We must express it in our prayers. It's not enough to think about how grateful we are to our families. We must tell them so, and often. And now let us relate all of this to the current situation. As we grapple with the COVID-19 crisis throughout the world, and of course in Israel. Our natural tendency is to gripe and complain. In Israel, 25% of people are unemployed. I cannot go to work in a regular fashion. Back at Pesach time, I could not attend a Seder with my family, just with my wife and my mother-in-law. At Shavuot, I could not attend a Tikkun Leil Shavuot. And now at Rosh Hashanah, we still don't know what's going to happen. And it could be that in Rosh Hashanah, we won't be allowed to walk more than 500 meters from our house. And we'll have to daven outdoors in minyanim of 10 or 20 people. All of this is true. But let us learn from Ben Zoma. We are much better off than past generations who experienced plagues like the Black Death, which killed between 75 and 200 million people, or the Spanish flu 100 years ago, which killed between 17 and 50 million people. They did not know the cause of those plagues, and they could not heal those who became ill. The same is true of the many plagues recorded in the Bible, the Talmud, and the responsa literature throughout Jewish history. We in the state of Israel should be very grateful. We have a government which is doing everything that it can to save the lives of all Israelis. Have they made mistakes? Of course they've made mistakes. They're human beings, but they're doing everything that they can in order to save our lives. And El Al flew all over the world in order to bring home stranded Israelis. And the Israeli army gave out food to many families who could not go out and shop. And doctors and nurses and thousands of volunteers are testing people and curing people and buying people groceries throughout the state of Israel. We should thank God that we live in the state of Israel or in Canada, and all of those people are helping us save lives and overcome this terrible plague. I hope and pray that we will get through this quickly, but in the meantime, we must cultivate an attitude of gratitude and be thankful for all of our blessings. The third lesson that I would like to expound today or relate to our current crisis is based on a sermon I gave many years ago called Running, or the contrast between running and slowing down. So first I'll begin with a cute story, which is told by a comedian from Mississippi about his good buddy, the Reverend Sam McCalwee. One day he had to preach a funeral, but he had a flat tire. He opened up the trunk, got out the jack, fixed the flat, brushed himself off, rushed off to the church, but no one was there. He ran into the church and he said, "Is the funeral over?" And they said, "Well, they're gone." "Where did they go? Where's the graveyard?" "Well, the deceased was Aunt Hattie Simmons and she grew up in Oak Grove, so I reckon they're taking her to the Oak Grove Cemetery." So Reverend Sam jumps in his car and rushes over there, and he saw a graveyard. And way up on the hill past the graveyard, there were two fellows throwing dirt in a hole. He jumped out of the car, ran up the hill, looked down the hole and said, "Well, I reckon I should say something since I'm preaching at the poor soul's funeral." He said, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We will remember this beautiful old lady the rest of our lives. Amen." He ran down the hill, jumped into his car, and rushed off to his next appointment. Well, Udell and Vernell Ledbetter were leaning on their shovel handles as they watched him drive off. And Udell says to Vernell, and he says, "You know, that's the first time I ever heard anybody preach a eulogy for a septic tank." The preacher was so busy getting there that he didn't have time to notice that he had arrived at the right place. And a similar story is told of Thomas Huxley, a well-known 19th century British biologist. Fearing he would be late for his own lecture, Huxley jumped on a passing horse-drawn carriage and ordered the coachman, "Top speed." The driver lost no time, whipped the horse, and stormed the horizon. It took a while, but eventually Huxley stuck his neck out of the cabin and shouted at the horseman, "Do you know where I want to go?" To which the driver answered, "No, sir, but I am riding as fast as I can." And finally, this brings us to the most elaborate story about running. And this is a story found in the second book of Samuel, towards the end, chapter 18. And it's a story about the tragic relations between King David and his son Absalom. As you may know, Absalom led a rebellion against David to seize the throne. David is forced to leave Jerusalem. He crosses the Jordan River. And before the decisive battle at a place called Machanaim, which still exists, David says to his troops, "Le'at li lanar la'Avshalom." Deal gently with my boy Absalom for my sake. After a fierce battle, David's army emerges victorious, but Yoav ben Tzruya, David's chief of staff, chose to ignore David's command. And when Absalom's long hair becomes entangled in a tree, Yoav kills Absalom. The story in the book of Samuel continues. Achimaatz, the son of Tzadok, said, "Let me run and report to the king that the Lord has vindicated him against the enemies." But Yoav said to him, "You shall not be the one to bring tidings today. You may bring tidings some other day, but you will not bring them today, for the king's son is dead." And Yoav said to the Cushite, "Go tell to the king what you have seen." The Cushite bowed to Yoav and ran off. They used to send messengers there with a runner. But Achimaatz, son of Tzadok, again says to Yoav, "No matter what, let me run too behind the Cushite." Yoav said, "Why should you run, my boy, when you have no news worth telling?" "I am going to run anyway." "Then run," says Yoav. Achimaatz ran by the way of the plain, and he passed the Cushite. In other words, the professional runner, the Cushite, is on his way to tell King David the news. And Achimaatz, who is a very fast runner, sets off on his own, and he soon passes the Cushite. When Achimaatz arrives, he calls out and says to the king, "All is well." He bows low with his face to the ground and says, "Praise be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against the Lord my king." The king asked, "Is my boy Absalom safe?" And Achimaatz answered, "I saw a large crowd when Yoav was sending your servant off, but I don't know what it was about." The king says, "Step aside and stand over there." So Achimaatz stands on the side and waits. And then the Cushite comes running up. He was much slower than Achimaatz. And the Cushite says, "Let my lord the king be informed that the Lord vindicated you today against all who rebelled against you." The king says to the Cushite, "Is my son Absalom safe?" And the Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rose against you to harm you fare like that young man." The king was shaken. He went up to the upper chamber of the gateway and wept, moaning these words as he wept, "My son Absalom, Bini Absalom, Bini Absalom, if I had only died instead of you. Mi iten muti tachtecha hayom. O Absalom, my son, Bini, Bini, Absalom." This dramatic story describes two runners. The first, Achimaatz, was clearly the faster of the two, yet despite his speed, he failed in his mission. When David asked him, "Hashalom lenar Absalom? Is my boy Absalom safe?" Achimaatz didn't know what to say, so he mumbled something incoherent about seeing a large crowd before he ran off. The Cushite, on the other hand, was not such a fast runner. He arrived second and lost the race. Yet when King David asked him, "Hashalom lanar Absalom, is my boy Absalom safe?" his reply was diplomatic yet entirely clear. "Iyu kanar oivei Adoni HaMelech v'chol asher kamu alecha lera'ah." May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rose against you to harm you fare like this young man. In other words, sometimes the faster runner is not the one who wins the race. Absalom got there first, but when he got there, he didn't know what to say. We are all runners on the road of life. We push and we shove and we run hither and thither, constantly striving to win the race. Yet I fear that many of us are suffering from the Achimaatz syndrome. We know that we want to win the race, but we don't know why we are running. We want to get there first, but we don't know where we are going or what we are going to do when we get there. We frequently look around and sound like the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. Oh dear, I shall be too late. Oh, the Duchess, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting?" Or perhaps we sound like the people in this poem by Michael Koist. "I went out, Lord. Men were coming and going, walking and running. Everything was rushing, cars, trucks, the street, the whole town. Men were rushing, not to waste time. They were rushing after time, to catch up with time, to gain time. Goodbye, sir. Excuse me, sir. I haven't time. I'll come back. I can't wait. I haven't time. I must end this letter. I haven't time. I'd love to help you, but I haven't time." I think that the current crisis was a remedy, or perhaps the pause button on this syndrome. All of Western society has the Achimat syndrome. We're constantly running and chasing, and we never stop. And what this crisis caused us to do was to push the pause button. We had to stay at home for long periods of time. We had to spend time with our families, like in the joke I talked at the beginning of our lecture. We had to talk to our wives, our children, our grandchildren. And it gave us a time to slow down and to think about where we came from and where we are going. So I think that a good value that came to the fore in this crisis is that we should not always be running. We need to push the pause button. The pause button can, of course, be Shabbat. The pause button can be the Jewish holidays, including Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But in general, we have to figure out Minayin balu ula'an anu holchim, as it says in Pirkei Avot, where we came from and where are we going. The fourth lesson I would like to learn from the current crisis is a lesson regarding curses and blessings. And I'm sure that you know that a few weeks ago in the Torah reading, Ki Tavo, Deuteronomy chapter 28, we read what's called the Tochacha, the rebuke. And as you know, the custom is that the Baal Kriya, in your case, Michael, the Baal Kriya reads the Torah reading in an undertone very quickly, because it contains a short list of blessings which the Jewish people will receive if they listen to God and observe his commandments, and a very long list of curses which will befall them if they don't. Similarly, you may be familiar with an expression which is very common in Israel. It's taken from a liturgical poem called Achot Ktana, and among the Sephardic Jews, it's recited on the first night of Rosh Hashanah at the Mariv service. Tichle shana v'kililoteha, tachel shana uvirchoteha. May the year end with its curses, and may a new year begin with its blessings. And as I said, this expression is very common in Israel today, in drashot, in sermons, in greeting cards, and so on and so forth. But the real potential, or the idea of curses and blessings, is found in the Unatana Tokef poem, which I mentioned a number of minutes ago. And of course, you know the list. Rosh Hashanah yikatevun. On Rosh Hashanah it will be written, and on Yom Kippur it will be inscribed. Kama yavrun v'kama yibareun. How many shall die and how many should be created? Mi yichya u'mi yamut. Who will live and who will die? Mi v'kitzo u'mi lo v'kitzo. Who at their end and who not at their end, and so on and so forth, who by fire, who by water. We all know the list. We are not God. We do not know who will live and who will die in the year ahead. We do not know who by earthquake or who by disease, who shall be tranquil or who shall suffer, who shall be poor or who shall be rich. But I think that Jewish tradition has given us the ability and the method to deal with whatever curses may lie ahead in the year to come. I believe that we can deal with the curses by turning them into blessings. And I would like to learn this lesson from Numbers chapter 22 to 24, which is the famous story of Bilam. As you know, the king Balak hires Bilam to curse the Jewish people, and Nebuch, Erez Shlamazel, he doesn't succeed in cursing the Jewish people. Every time he tries to curse the Jewish people, it comes out a blessing. The most famous one being Matovu o Alecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. The question is, why? Why did Bilam's curses turn into blessings? Was it the work of God? Well, many people think so. For example, it says in the book of Dvarim, chapter 23, instead the Lord God turned the curse into a blessing for you. In other words, according to the book of Dvarim, it was God who changed Bilam's curses into blessings. And similarly, we have a midrash which says, when Bilam came to curse Israel, God twisted his tongue around and he began to bless instead. That is the pshat, that is the simple meaning which is given by many of the commentators. However, in a number of other midrashim, we find a different scenario. According to those midrashim, Bilam did indeed intend to curse the people of Israel, but when he saw their exemplary behavior, he changed his mind and he blessed them instead. Thus, for example, we read in the tractate of Bava Batra, folio 60a, and Bilam looked up and he saw Israel encamped tribe by tribe, which is a verse from Numbers. What did he see? Rabbi Yochanan said, he saw that the openings of their tents did not face each other. He said, this people is worthy of having God's presence rest upon them. And the Rashbam adds in his commentary there on the Talmud, that is why Bilam said a few verses later, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. A similar idea is expressed in another midrash found in Bamidbar Rabbah, but when Bilam saw how Israel observed the most trivial commandments, he said, who can curse those who observe God's commandments? In other words, according to these midrashim, Bilam did not turn his curses into blessings because of some miraculous intervention by God, but rather because he was so favorably impressed by the behavior of the Jewish people. According to one midrash, he was impressed by their modesty. They set up their tents in such a way that one person could not see into the tent of another person. And according to another midrash, he was impressed by their scrupulous observance of the mitzvot, of the commandments. I think that the Jewish people throughout history have excelled at turning curses into blessings. And this was stated in a clever fashion by Mendele Moicher Sfarim, one of the founders of modern Hebrew and Yiddish literature. In his book Shlomo Reb Chaim's, Mendele Moicher Sfarim says, there is a kind of cheese which is full of bacteria, and gourmets pay a high price for it and consume it with relish. Just so is Jewish life. Its bitterness is its wondrous savor. Let us see three examples of this throughout Jewish history, where the Jewish people took a terrible curse and turned it into a blessing. What could be a bigger curse than our slavery in Egypt? We were there in slavery for hundreds of years. Others might have taken that lesson and become embittered and taken revenge, but we turned that curse into a blessing. Time after time, the Torah commands us not to oppress the stranger, the widow, the orphan, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. V'ahavtem et hager, ki gerim heitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You shall not pervert the judgment of the stranger or the orphan, nor take the widow's garment as a pledge. For you will remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. And so on and so forth. Many verses in the Bible repeat this. The curse of slavery led to the blessing of social justice and empathy for the downtrodden, which has persisted in Judaism for 3,000 years. What could be a bigger curse than the destruction of the Second Temple, which I mentioned before in relation to Titus? In the year 70 the temple is destroyed, hundreds of thousands of Jews are killed, hundreds of thousands of Jews are sold into slavery and taken into exile. And yet the Tanaim transformed that curse into a series of blessings. They replaced the temple with the synagogue. They replaced the sacrifices with prayer. They replaced the inherited privileges of the priesthood, kiunah, with the meritocracy of the rabbinate. They created the Mishnah, which became the basis for the Talmud and all of subsequent Jewish law. They turned military defeat into spiritual victory. They turned a terrible curse into wonderful blessings which have lasted for 2,000 years. And the third and final example happened in recent times. What could be a bigger curse than the Shoah, than the Holocaust? 1/3 of the Jewish people were brutally murdered. Thousands of Jewish communities were wiped out, and the survivors had nowhere to go and no families to which they could return. And yet between 1945 and 1948, the Jewish people rose from the ashes. Many of the survivors made their way to Israel. They fought for the land and settled her. They built cities and planted crops. They created the state of Israel. They created high tech, and Israel is now one of the leaders in the world in high tech. In short, they turned our worst disaster into our greatest success. They turned a terrible curse into a wonderful blessing, which continues to grow and prosper from year to year. This is what we need to do with the current curse. There is no question that COVID-19 is a terrible curse. As I said before, almost 1 million people have died, 27 million people have become ill. But we have to find the way to turn those curses into blessings. Whether it's the blessing of many thousands of shiurim, of Torah lessons on Zoom. I've given more Torah lessons on Zoom since March than multiples of what I did in my entire life before. Between Purim and Shavuot, I gave 19 lectures on Zoom in Hebrew or English, and that has continued throughout the summer and now into the fall. Other blessings that we can learn from this: how to help each other even in times of crisis, whether it's by delivering groceries to elderly people who cannot leave their homes, much of this being done by young people and teenagers. In Israel, much of it being done by young Israeli soldiers. If we put our heads to it, we can think of many positive ways to turn this curse into blessings in the year to come. And finally, the last lesson that I would like to learn from the current crisis is the blessing of kindness. Kindness in Hebrew is called chesed. And the word chesed appears innumerable times in the Bible, in rabbinic literature. I'd just like to share with you a few sources and then tell you 3 stories. The first source is, of course, the 13 attributes of God, Yud Gimel Midot, which we chant many times on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Adonai, Adonai, Arachum V'Chanun, etc., etc. Notzer Chesed La'alafim, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation. In other words, one of God's main attributes among the 13 is chesed, extending chesed, kindness, to the 1,000th generation. And this again is found in the book of Micha, chapter 6, verse 8. Higid lecha adam matov uma Adonai doresh mimcha, ki im asot mishpat ve'avat chesed ve'atznei alechet im Elohecha. O man, you have been told what is good and what it is that the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. So in the Bible, chesed, or kindness, is a central attribute of God. It atones for our sins. It is preferable to sacrifices, and God tells us time after time to do chesed. In rabbinic literature, this concept became the concept of gmilut chasadim, which is very hard to translate. It's usually translated as acts of loving kindness, but in Hebrew it's much prettier. Gmilut chasadim, the bestowing of chesed, the bestowing of kindness. And I'll just share with you one famous rabbinic passage from the tractate of Sota, folio 14a. Rav Chama, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, what does the text mean? Ve'halachta acharei Elohim, you shall walk after the Lord your God. Deuteronomy chapter 13. Is it possible for a human being to walk after the Shekhinah? For has it not been said that God is Esh Ochelet, that God is like a devouring fire? But the meaning is to walk after the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be He. Just as He clothes the naked, so shall you clothe the naked. And it quotes the verse about God clothing Adam. Just as God visits the sick, and it tells the story of Genesis chapter 18 of the angels visiting Abraham, so should you visit the sick. Just as God comforts the mourners, and it talks about God comforting Abraham after the death of Sarah, so should you comfort the mourners. Just as God buries the dead, He buries Moses at the end of Deuteronomy, so should you bury the dead. In other words, this is what's called in Latin imitatio Dei, imitating God, that our tradition says to us, Why should you do gmilut chasadim? Why should you do acts of loving kindness? Because by doing those acts of loving kindness, you are imitating God. God showed us the way in the Torah how to do acts of chesed. You too should do acts of chesed. And now I would like to skip forward in my conclusion with 3 modern stories about chesed. The first is a story that has become famous during the past few years because of the Broadway musical Come From Away, which of course takes place in Canada. You may know the story that due to the disaster, the terrorist attack at the World Trade Center, all flights heading to the US were diverted. Dozens of airplanes from all over the world made unscheduled landings at Gander, Newfoundland. And one of the flight attendants on Delta Flight 15 bound for Atlanta relates that her plane landed in Gander at 12:30 p.m. One by one, the planes deplaned. In the end, Gander had a population of 10,400 people, but they had to take care of some 6,500 stranded passengers. In other words, 2/3 of the population of their city had now landed in Gander. And the musical and the story goes on to tell us that they ended up hosting these total strangers for a number of days, giving them shelter, clothing, food, all sorts of incredible acts of chesed. And finally, at the end of the story, on the way back from Gander to Atlanta, one of the passengers says on the airplane on the PA system of the incredible kindness of the people of Lewisport. And he said that he was going to set up a trust fund under the name of Delta 15. You can look it up on the internet. It's called Lewisport Area Flight 15 Scholarship Fund. They passed around a sheet of paper, and the total was $14,000. Since then, they have raised over $1.5 million to give scholarships to high school students in Lewisport so that they continue on to college. In other words, they met chesed with chesed. The second story is about Rabbanit Bracha Kapach, a famous doer of chesed in Jerusalem, whom I had the privilege of knowing for many years. And this story took place over the course of 50 years in Jerusalem. Bracha Kapach was born in Yemen in 1922. She made Aliyah at the age of 11. She was married to the famous Rabbi Yosef Kapach, one of the most important Talmud scholars in the state of Israel. And she made it her life's work, having come from total poverty. She made it her life's work to provide Shabbat meals for many families every week, to set up day camps for poor children, to help people with every domestic problem under the sun. She kept a warehouse of used clothing in a big room under her house. She arranged for exercise classes for poor women. She provided elaborate Yemenite wedding dresses for any brides who needed them. But the pièce de résistance, the most memorable thing she did every year, was kimcha de pischa, flour for Pesach, food for Pesach. And by the end of her life, she lived till over the age of 90. She was providing 6,000 families with food every year for Pesach. And I used to collect money every year, and I could have sent her a check in the mail. I did not send her a check in the mail. I collected money from the students at Schechter, from other people, my own contributions, and I took one of my children every year before Pesach to see Rabbanit Kapach, so that they would know what a tzaddiket, what a righteous woman looks like. So you have to understand, she didn't buy the food for 6,000 families after she collected the money. She bought the food before she had the money. And every year I would say to her, Rabbanit Kapach, how are you going to pay for this? And she would say, Hashem Yirachem, God will have mercy, God will provide. And in the end, there was always enough money to cover the cost of the food. So this woman who had grown up in a very poor situation did chesed her entire life to many tens of thousands of people in the city of Jerusalem and elsewhere. And finally, Acharon Chaviv, last but not least, the story of my uncle Baruch, Zichrono Livracha, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, Rabbi Baruch Gershon Goldstein, a Holocaust survivor, who passed away in May 2017 at the age of 94. And he was one of the people whom I considered one of the Lamed Vavniks, one of the 36 righteous people upon which the world stands. And in his Holocaust memoir, which is called For Decades I Was Silent, at the beginning of the book, he quotes the verse that I quoted before from the book of Micha. O man, you have been told what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. I believe that Uncle Baruch emphasized this verse because he lived according to these three ideals. But I would like to focus on the word ahavat chesed, to love kindness. My Uncle Baruch, who spent 3.5 years in Auschwitz, was one of the kindest people that I ever met. He was kind to his immediate family, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, his in-laws, my parents, Rabbi Noah Golinkin, his brother-in-law, and Dvorah Golinkin, his sister-in-law, all of them of blessed memory. He was also kind to thousands of people in the places in which he lived, in Massachusetts, in California, in Oregon, in Providence, Rhode Island, in Florida, and in Israel. And he was also very kind to total strangers whom he had just met. He performed countless acts of chesed. On a number of occasions, he called me in Jerusalem, and he asked me to help specific people who had specific problems. And in each case, I spent years helping those people because Uncle Baruch had asked me to help those people. He was also a generous donor of tzedakah to many worthy causes, including the Schechter Institute. Many years ago, he gave us an endowment for the Meyer and Tirza Goldstein Holocaust Memorial Library. The result of that endowment is that we have published over 30 books related to halacha and other areas of Jewish studies, thanks to the endowment created by Uncle Baruch. But the question is, what was the source of his chesed? What was the source of his kindness? Mela, a person who had had an easy life, but a person who spent 6 years under Nazi occupation, 1,000 days at Auschwitz, lost 45 members of his extended family who were murdered by the Nazis, spent his entire life after the war doing chesed. Most people who emerged from such an experience would have been angry, or perhaps they would have focused on their own welfare. Yet Rabbi Goldstein emerged in May 1945 with a love for all human beings, and he spent the next 72 years of his life doing acts of chesed. What was the source of that kindness? Some of it came from his parents, Meyer and Tirza Zal, as he wrote in his memoir that they were kind, gentle, and soft-spoken people. Some of it came from his beloved wife, Riva, my aunt. Many times in his book, he describes her kindness to him that restored him to life and health after the Holocaust. But the night before the funeral, my brother, Cantor Abe Golinkin, told me the third reason for Uncle Baruch's kindness, which I did not know. Many years ago, Abe and my parents, Zal, traveled to Mission Viejo, California, in order to attend the bat mitzvah of Liza, Uncle Baruch's granddaughter. Uncle Baruch took them along in his car to perform a mitzvah, probably Bikur Cholim, to visit a sick person. In the car, he told them that he is constantly involved in doing chesed for people. The reason is that during the Holocaust, many different people had helped him in many different ways. He feels a debt of gratitude, but he has no way of thanking those people. In many cases, he didn't even know their name. So he is thanking them by passing on kindness. He told Abe and my parents that they too should pass on kindness. It's like a ripple in a pond. In that way, one person will help many people. Those people will in turn help others, and the world will be filled with kindness. So therefore, my fifth message to you for the year to come is the message of Micha, Ahavat Chesed, to love kindness. The message of our sages, Gmilut Chasadim, to perform acts of kindness. And the message of Lewisport, of Rabbanit Kapach, and of Rabbi Baruch Gershon Goldstein Zatzal, to pass on kindness. If each of us will help others, they in turn will help others. and the world will be filled with kindness. So my message to you for this very unusual Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is, number one, to regain a sense of humility. Number two, to develop an attitude of gratitude. Number three, to stop running and sit still and catch up with ourselves and with Judaism and with God. Number four, to learn how to turn curses into blessings. And number five, to pass on kindness. I think that these 5 lessons from our tradition will help us overcome much of the stress and fear which we might fall victim to because of the current pandemic. I wish all of my friends at Beth David, the entire Jewish people, and the entire world a Shana Tova Umetuka, a good and sweet year. Shana Tova.